A giant woman steps off a train, promised a new life, only to be humiliated in front of an entire town. The man who wrote her letters, the one who swore he'd cherish her, is gone without a trace. Now she's stranded in the freezing mountains, clutching nothing but a pink suitcase and the shattered pieces of a dream. But just when all hope seems lost, an unexpected stranger walks through the blizzard, a rugged mountain man with eyes that burn hotter than his cabin fire. And when the whole town calls her too big, he says the two words that will change everything. You're perfect. What happens when the woman everyone mocked becomes the one thing he'll risk his life to protect? And how far will they both go when the mountain, and a man who refuses to take no for an answer, decides to tear them apart? Will this giant bride find love in the most dangerous place on earth, or will she lose everything in the storm? The train's whistle was a knife cutting through the cold mountain air. Its echo bounced off the snow-covered peaks, a lonely sound in a lonely place. White steam billowed around the locomotive as it ground to a halt, the screech of metal on frozen rails setting your teeth on edge. The platform was made of old weathered wood, and it groaned under Clara's careful steps as she descended from the passenger car. She ducked her head. It was a habit, born from a lifetime of bumping into door frames and low-hanging ceiling beams. Even out here, in the wide-open wilderness, the roof of the small station hung uncomfortably close, a constant reminder that the world wasn't built for someone like her. Her old wool dress, a dark blue number she'd altered a dozen times herself, pulled tight across her shoulders and hips. The fabric was tired, stretched thin from trying to accommodate her tall frame. In one gloved hand, she clutched a pink suitcase. Its cheerful color was a splash of defiance against the gray and white landscape. In her other hand, she held Edward's letter. The paper was soft and worn from being read and reread 1,000 times. Her heart fluttered with the words she'd memorized, the words that had brought her all this way. My dearest Clara, your letters have touched my very soul. I await your arrival with joyful anticipation. Together, we'll build a life far from the cruel whispers you've endured. Her chest tightened with a hope so fierce it almost hurt. She scanned the small crowd on the platform, her eyes searching for the kind face she'd imagined for weeks. All she saw were rough-looking men in heavy coats, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Women in thick shawls huddled together, stealing glances in her direction. She heard them. Of course she heard them. The whispered conversations, the familiar sight of hands covering smirking mouths. Look at the size of her. Must be 6 feet if she's an inch. Poor fellow who gets stuck with that one. She stood a little straighter, trying to project a dignity she didn't feel. The familiar ache was building in her chest, a heavy stone she'd carried her whole life. But surely Edward would step forward any moment. He was different. He'd written such beautiful words, promising to look past appearances, to see the beauty of her spirit. The minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. The bitter wind found every gap in her coat, a garment that had always been too short in the sleeves, another small, daily humiliation. She paced the platform, each turn bringing a fresh wave of disappointment when Edward's face didn't appear in the thinning crowd. A man's voice carried across the platform, followed by a burst of rough laughter. Bet she'd break any bed she laid in. More woman than any man could handle, another added, triggering more cruel chuckles. Each comment landed like a physical blow. Clara had heard variations of these jokes all her life. But here, in this place where she dared to hope for acceptance, they cut deeper than ever before. The afternoon sun slipped behind the mountains, casting long, cold shadows across the now empty platform. The last of the onlookers drifted away, leaving her utterly alone with her wilting hopes and the biting wind. The letter, the one that had felt like a lifeline, crumpled in her trembling hand. It wasn't a promise. It was just another lie. Lantern light flickered from the station windows, a weak, lonely glow against the gathering dark. Clara stared at the crushed paper in her hand, then let it fall into the snow. It disappeared without a sound. I guess, her voice was a tiny, quavering thing in the vast, empty air. He changed his mind. The words came out as a whisper, stolen and carried away by the cold. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her pink suitcase. The cheerful color seemed to mock her now, a stupid, childish reminder of her own foolish optimism. She straightened her spine, fighting back the tears that threatened to freeze on her cheeks. With heavy, measured steps, Clara walked toward the depot office. Each footfall echoed the breaking of her heart, the weight of another shattered dream. The next train couldn't come soon enough. She just had to get away from this place, this town where hope had come to die in the mountain cold. She pushed open the depot office door, wincing at the loud creak that announced her arrival. The small room smelled of stale tobacco and old paper. Dust motes danced in the few shafts of fading daylight, filtering through the grimy windows. Behind a scratched wooden counter, an elderly station master looked up from his ledger. A stub of a cigarette, long since gone out, was clenched between his yellowed teeth. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked, his voice gravelly from a lifetime of smoking. His eyes widened slightly as he took in her full height, his gaze traveling upward until it finally found her face. But to his credit, he didn't comment. He didn't let his gaze linger. Clara had learned to read the subtle shifts in expression, the widening eyes, the slight step backward, the quick, silent recalculation of how to deal with her. "Yes, sir," Clara said softly. She instinctively hunched her shoulders, trying to make herself seem smaller in the cramped space. It was a habit she hated, a protective reflex born from a lifetime of unwanted attention. "I need to book passage home. On the next train." The station master scratched his stubbled chin, flipping through a dog-eared schedule book with tobacco-stained fingers. The pages whispered against each other. "Well now, ain't no passenger train due through here until next week." He paused, his wrinkled face softening with something that looked like sympathy. "There's a freight train leaving at dawn, though. Ain't comfortable. Just a hard bench in the caboose, if you're willing. Gets mighty cold back there, too." Clara's heart sank. She couldn't bear staying in this town a moment longer. Each minute felt like an eternity on display, her failure exposed for everyone to see and whisper about. "That will do fine," she managed, forcing a grimace that she hoped looked like a smile. "I just need to get home." She dug into her pocket and pulled out her last few coins. The metal felt cold against her palm as she counted them out onto the counter. The pitiful stack barely rose above the worn wood grain. The station master wrote out her ticket with painful slowness, his arthritic fingers trembling slightly. "Waiting room's through there," he said, jerking his thumb toward a door with peeling paint. "Ain't much, but the stove's been burning since morning." Clara nodded her thanks and retreated into the waiting room. A row of wooden benches lined the walls, their varnish worn away by countless travelers. She sank onto one, the wood creaking beneath her weight, and placed her pink suitcase at her feet. The black windows reflected her image like dark mirrors. She couldn't escape the sight of herself. Too tall, too broad, too different. Movement outside caught her eye. A group of townsfolk walked past, their faces pressing against the glass as they peered in at her with undisguised curiosity. Their laughter, muffled by the window, still reached her ears like tiny needles. A woman pointed, nudging her companion. A small girl, no more than 6 or 7, broke away from her mother's hand and ran up to the window. She pressed her face against the glass, her breath fogging the pain. "Big lady," the child mouthed, her eyes wide with a fascination that wasn't cruel, but somehow hurt even more. Her mother quickly pulled her away, a mortified expression on her face. But the damage was done. The word triggered an avalanche of memories. Giant girl echoing through school hallways. Tall freak whispered at church socials. Every dance she'd ever attended, standing alone against the wall, while other girls twirled in the arms of eager partners. She remembered the 2 boys who drew straws to see who would be stuck, asking her to dance, just as a dare. The humiliation had burned like fire. She remembered all the nights spent on her knees, praying for someone, anyone, to truly see her. For a brief, shining moment, she'd thought Edward's letter was the answer to those prayers. Her stomach growled, a loud, embarrassing sound in the quiet room. Across the street, warm light spilled from the windows of a small diner. The thought of walking across that open space, of enduring more stares and whispers, of folding her frame into a chair that was too small, made her chest tighten. She couldn't face it. Not tonight. Instead, Clara pulled her coat tighter. She lay down on the hard bench, her legs hanging over the end, because she was too tall to fit. The wood was unyielding against her back, but the ache in her heart was so much worse. Tomorrow, she whispered into the empty room, it'll all be over. Outside, the snow began to fall, thick and silent. The lantern light dimmed as its oil ran low, casting long, lonely shadows across the floor. The first hints of dawn were just creeping through the depot windows, painting pale streaks across the wooden floor. Clara sat hunched on the bench, her muscles stiff and aching. The waiting room was as cold as the mountain outside. Her stomach cramped with a hunger so sharp it was dizzying. A sudden flash of light cut through the pre-dawn darkness. Bright beams slashed across the snow-covered ground as an old truck rumbled into view, its engine growling a protest against the cold. Clara straightened, her heart leaping into her throat. She stood quickly, grabbing her suitcase with trembling hands. Hope, dangerous and stupid, fluttered in her chest. Could it be Edward? Maybe he'd been delayed. Maybe there had been a terrible misunderstanding. Maybe. The truck's door creaked open, and a man stepped out into the swirling snow. He wasn't anything like the man she'd imagined. This man was shorter than her, but broad, his frame solid with the kind of muscle built from hard work. Snow immediately began to collect in his dark beard. He strode toward the depot entrance with a sense of purpose, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. The door swung open, bringing a blast of cold air that smelled of pine trees. His eyes found her immediately. They were dark and intense. You, her? His voice was deep, cutting through the icy morning air like a warm knife. Clara stared down at him, her confusion washing over her. I don't know, she whispered. Who did he think she was? He stepped closer. His eyes were a warm brown, like coffee with a touch of cream. He extended a calloused hand toward her, palm up. Name's Jack. You answered my ad. Ad? Clara's confusion deepened. She'd only answered one ad. Edwards. Placed it 3 months back, Jack explained, his hand still extended, patient. Looking for a woman strong enough to survive up in these mountains. His gaze traveled up her height, but unlike every other man she'd ever met, there was no mockery in his eyes. Instead, she saw something that made her cheeks warm despite the cold. She saw appreciation, a kind of heat that had nothing to do with the temperature. Looks like I got more than I asked for, he finished, a slow grin spreading across his face. Clara's mind was whirling. She hadn't answered his ad. She was sure of it. She'd only written to Edward, whose lying letter was now buried somewhere under the freshish snow outside. But here was this man, this stranger, looking at her like she was exactly what he'd been searching for. Jack tilted his head toward his truck, snow falling from his beard with the movement. Train won't keep you warm, he said simply. Then with a conviction that made her breath catch in her throat, he added, I will. The blizzard wind howled around the old building, sounding like a warning. Or maybe, just maybe, it was a promise. Clara stood frozen, caught between two impossible choices. Behind her lay the hard bench and a cold journey back to a life of whispers and sideways glances. Before her stood a stranger, offering warmth, a home, and something else entirely. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she took one step forward, then another. She was moving toward Jack, toward his waiting hand, and she had no idea if she was running from her past or straight into a far more dangerous future. The truck's ancient heater blasted warm air that smelled of oil and wet wool. It roared with effort, fighting against the steep incline and the storm that hammered the windshield with thick, wet flakes. Clara sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her long legs cramped in the tight space, her knees brushing the dashboard, no matter how she tried to adjust. Jack handled the wheel with an easy confidence, his forearms flexing as he navigated the treacherous road. The sleeves of his flannel shirt were rolled up despite the cold, revealing skin tanned even in the dead of winter. Every few minutes, his eyes would slide toward her, quick, assessing glances that sent a strange warmth spreading across her cheeks. He reached down without taking his eyes off the road and pulled out a crinkled paper sack. Hungry? He asked, offering it to her. It's just jerky, but it's good. Made it myself. Clara shook her head, though her empty stomach screamed in protest. She was still too overwhelmed, too stunned by this man's self-assured manner and the way he'd simply assumed she'd come with him, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Suit yourself," he said, tucking the bag away. His eyes stayed on the nearly invisible road ahead. "My place is about an hour up, deep in the timberlands. Nearest neighbor's 5 miles as the crow flies." He glanced at her again, gauging her reaction. "You'll like it. It's quiet. Safe." Clara's hands twisted in her lap. "I should tell you," she said, her voice soft. I didn't. I didn't come here for you. I came for someone else. A man named Edward. He was supposed to meet me yesterday." Jack's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath his beard. He snorted a short, sharp sound of contempt. "Edward Thompson?" At her nod, he shook his head. "Town's biggest coward. He's known for writing pretty letters to lonely women, then hiding like a rabbit when they actually show up." The truth of it stung, a fresh slap of humiliation, even though she'd already suspected it. The truck began to climb higher, deeper into the mountains, and the storm intensified. The wind buffeted the vehicle, making it sway dangerously. Suddenly, they hit a patch of ice. The back end fishtailed, sliding with terrifying speed toward the sheer drop-off on their right. Jack cursed under his breath, but his hands remained impossibly steady on the wheel as he corrected their course, his movements sure and calm. When he caught sight of Clara's white-knuckled grip on the door handle, he flashed her a quick, reckless grin that made her heart skip a beat. "Don't worry, big girl. I've tamed worse than this." The nickname should have made her bristle. She'd heard it 1,000 times, always dripping with cruelty. But there was something different in Jack's voice, a teasing warmth, a challenge, that sent heat curling low in her stomach instead of anger rising in her chest. The snow grew deeper as they climbed, the drifts nearly bearing the narrow road. Clara could barely see through the white curtain swirling around them, but Jack drove as if he could navigate these mountains with his eyes closed. Finally, the truck lurched up one last hill, its engine straining, and broke through into a clearing. And there, nestled under a stand of towering pine trees, stood a log cabin. It was larger than she had expected, its sturdy walls speaking of careful craftsmanship. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a thin gray ribbon against the storm, promising warmth within. Jack killed the engine. A sudden, profound silence fell over them, broken only by the howling wind outside. He turned to face her fully for the first time since they'd started driving. The intensity in his dark eyes made her breath catch. "Welcome home," he said. Just 2 simple words, but they carried a weight that made Clara's heart thunder against her ribs. She swallowed hard, staring at the cabin through the swirling snow. Yesterday morning, she'd stepped onto a train believing she was heading toward a safe, predictable future. Now, 24 hours later, she sat beside a stranger who looked at her like she was something precious instead of peculiar, offering her a life she could never have imagined. She had no idea what was waiting for her inside that cabin, but as she looked at the determined set of Jack's jaw, she had a terrifying thought. Maybe she hadn't escaped danger at all. Maybe she had just traded one kind for another. The truck's tires crunched to a stop beside the cabin. Through the frosted window, Clara saw massive pine trees looming like dark, watchful giants, their branches heavy with a fresh coat of snow. Jack hopped out with the easy grace of someone born to this wilderness, his boots leaving crisp tracks as he circled around to her door. He swung it wide and extended a calloused hand. "Careful now," he warned, his voice a low rumble. "Porch gets slick as glass in this weather." Clara hesitated for a heartbeat before placing her gloved hand in his. She could feel the strength in his grip even through the fabric. On level ground, she stood nearly a head taller than him, but Jack didn't seem bothered. If anything, his eyes held a glimmer of appreciation as he looked up at her. The cabin door opened with a solid thunk, releasing a wave of blessed warmth that washed over Clara's frozen face. The interior was a single large room with a sleeping loft accessed by a sturdy ladder. A fire crackled in a cast-iron stove, casting dancing shadows on the polished wooden walls. Oil lamps gave everything a golden, cozy glow. It felt both rugged and safe. Jack grabbed her pink suitcase from the truck bed, lifting it as if it weighed nothing. He carried it to a sturdy bed pushed against the far wall, its frame clearly handmade. "This will be your spot," he said, setting the suitcase down. Clara glanced around the room, noting the obvious lack of another bed. "And where will you sleep?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. A grin tugged at Jack's beard. He reached up and tapped a neatly folded hammock hanging near the stove. "Not my first winter sharing space," he said with a wink. "I know how to make do." The cabin's warmth was starting to seep into Clara's bones, making her aware of how cold and damp her dress was. Jack seemed to notice. He gestured to a thick quilt hanging from a rope strung across one corner of the room. "You can change behind there. There are some warmer clothes in that chest by the bed if you need them." Clara nodded gratefully and ducked behind the quilt. As she changed, she caught Jack's reflection in a window pane. He was pretending to check the firewood, but his eyes were drawn to her silhouette against the quilt's fabric. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down her spine. Dinner was simple, a pot of beans that had been simmering on the stove all day, served with thick slices of golden cornbread. They ate by lantern light at a small table. At first the conversation was halting, but gradually the warmth of the cabin seemed to thaw the silence between them. Jack told her about learning to chop timber when he was just 14, working alongside men twice his size. His voice held a quiet pride as he described building this cabin with his own two hands, cutting and shaping each log himself. Clara found herself opening up too, admitting in a quiet voice how no man in her hometown had ever stuck around long enough to really know her. Jack's eyes softened at that, but he didn't offer empty pity, something she appreciated more than he could know. As the night deepened, Jack efficiently set up his hammock, the routine clearly familiar. Clara curled up on the bed. It was beautifully made, but like everything else in her life, it was still too short for her frame. She bent her knees, listening to the soft whisper of snow against the roof. The cabin was warm. The bed was comfortable. Jack had been a perfect gentleman. She should have felt completely safe. So why did her heart pound like a drum every time he moved in the small space? And why did she have the unsettling feeling that the real storm wasn't the one raging outside, but the one that was just beginning to brew right here, between the two of them? Dawn crept through the frosted windows, painting the cabin in a soft, pearly glow. Clara stirred, the scent of fresh coffee and wood smoke filling her nose. It was mixed with something earthier, the tang of male sweat and fresh-cut pine. She blinked the sleep from her eyes and immediately wished she hadn't. Jack stood at a chopping block he dragged inside, his broad back bare to the waist despite the morning chill. Muscles rippled beneath his skin as he brought the axe down, splitting kindling with a practiced, fluid ease. A fine sheen of sweat made his shoulders gleam in the early light. Clara's cheeks blazed hot. She quickly looked away, but not before his head turned, catching her gaze. He didn't pause in his work, just offered a casual nod. "Sleep okay, big girl?" The phrase hit her like a splash of ice water. She stiffened, her spine going rigid. She'd heard those words 1,000 times, always dripping with mockery. But when she risked another glance at Jack, his expression held something different. The quirk of his lips wasn't cruel. It was a challenge. He was testing her. She threw back the covers and stood to her full height, deliberately letting him see just how big she was. "I slept fine," she said, her voice firm, "and I can help with that." Jack's laugh was rich and deep. "No need. I've been doing this since—" The words died in his throat. Clara had stepped forward and, with a single arm, effortlessly hefted one of the largest logs from his pile, one thicker around than his torso. She placed it carefully on the chopping block, then stepped back. The smirk fell from Jack's face. It was replaced by something that made her breath catch. His eyes darkened with unmistakable admiration as they traveled from her face, down to her arms, then back up again. The axe hung forgotten in his grip. "Well," he said, his voice rough, "guess I was wrong." They worked together to split the rest of the wood, falling into an easy, powerful rhythm. When the pile was done, Jack brewed fresh coffee and pulled out some biscuits. They sat at the small table, steam rising from their cups in the quiet morning. "So," Jack said after a while, his voice carefully neutral, "you mentioned a letter yesterday, from someone named Edward." Clara's fingers tightened around her cup. "Yes, He, he wrote such beautiful things, promised me a home, acceptance, said he didn't care about my size. She pulled the crumpled paper from her dress pocket, smoothing it on the table. But when I arrived, he wasn't there. Jack's jaw clenched. He stood abruptly and returned to the chopping block, even though all the wood was already split. The axe bit deep into the wood with more force than necessary. Some men, he growled between strikes, write things they can't back up. Pretty words are easy on paper. Standing tall beside a strong woman, that takes more backbone than most men have. Clara watched him, a conflict churning in her gut. She hadn't planned this, staying in a stranger's cabin, no matter how compelling that stranger might be. The proper thing to do would be to leave, to find her way back to the life she knew. But the window panes rattled as another gust of wind hit the cabin. The snow was falling faster now, a thick, swirling curtain of white. Jack moved to the doorway and pushed it open, scanning the heavy sky with experienced eyes. "Storm's not done with us yet," he announced, shaking his head. "We'll need to check the roof later." Clara stood by the window, watching the snow build up in drifts against the cabin walls. She'd come here chasing a promise made in ink, following words that had turned out to be as worthless as smoke. But now, looking at Jack's solid presence in the doorway, she couldn't help but wonder a terrifying thing. Why did this stranger, with his quiet strength and his testing smiles, feel so much more like the truth? The wind picked up as midday approached, howling through the pines and rattling the cabin's shutters. Clara stood beside Jack near the woodpile. Her sleeves rolled to her elbows despite the biting cold, stacking logs into her arms. "We'll need enough to last through tonight," Jack said, his voice nearly lost in a fresh gust. "This storm's getting meaner." Clara nodded, easily matching his pace. Her height let her reach the higher logs on the stack, and she found herself smiling at how natural it felt to work alongside him. There were no awkward apologies for her strength, no nervous glances when she lifted more than him. Just steady, quiet teamwork. The wind whipped harder, sending loose snow swirling around their boots. Clara took a step forward, her arms full of logs, but her foot hit a patch of ice hidden beneath the powder. She lurched sideways, the wood tumbling from her grip. Jack moved fast. His hands caught her waist, strong and sure, steadying her before she could fall. The position left him pressed against her, his head level with her collarbone, her hands instinctively gripping his powerful shoulders to keep her balance. Time seemed to freeze. Clara could feel the heat of his palms through the fabric of her dress, the solid warmth of his chest against her. This close, she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, the way his breath caught slightly as he looked up at her. Neither of them moved, neither of them breathed. Then Jack stepped back, clearing his throat. His voice came out rough. Let's get this inside." They carried the scattered wood into the cabin. The fire crackled welcomingly in the hearth. Clara settled beside it gratefully, hiking her skirts up just enough to warm her cold legs. Jack sat in his chair, pulling out an oilcloth and his axe to clean it, but she noticed his eyes straying to her far more often than to the blade. "My mother used to do that," he said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Sit by the fire just like that after working outside." Clara turned to face him, drawn by the unexpected softness in his tone. "Tell me about her." Jack's hands moved steadily over the axe handle as he spoke. "Strongest woman I ever knew. Raised me alone after my father left. Wouldn't take a dime of charity from anyone. She was tall, too. Not like you, but enough that people noticed." A small, sad smile touched his lips. Never let it bother her, though. Said God made her that way for a reason. "What happened to her?" Clara asked gently. "Fever. 5 winters ago." Jack's movement slowed. "But she lived her life exactly as she wanted. She never apologized for who she was." Clara watched his profile in the firelight, seeing past the gruff exterior to the man beneath, a man who learned to respect strong women at his mother's knee. Something warm and hopeful unfurled in her chest. "Jack," she ventured, "why did you really place an ad for a wife? There must be women in town who'd have you." He shrugged, but his shoulders held a tension that betrayed him. A man gets tired of talking to trees. His eyes met hers across the room, dark and intense, saying far more than his simple words. As evening settled, they sat close together in the lamplight. Jack showed her how to mend a tear in his old coat, his calloused fingers demonstrating the neat stitches. Clara followed his example, though her own hands shook slightly at his proximity. Their fingers brushed as she passed him the needle. A jolt of pure awareness shot through her, but then a sobering thought struck her, a cold dose of reality. "Jack," she said, setting the coat down carefully, what if Edward comes looking for me?" The muscles in Jack's jaw clenched tight. He stared into the fire, its light casting hard shadows across his face. He said nothing. But his silence and the fierce, determined set of his expression spoke volumes. It was an answer more powerful than any words. It was a promise. Morning arrived with a harsh, brittle beauty. Sunlight glinted off ice-crusted snow, and the air bit sharp enough to steal your breath. Clara watched from the cabin window as Jack checked the truck's engine, his movements quick and practiced. "She'll start," he called, slamming the hood shut. "We better get moving before the weather turns again." Clara pulled on her thin coat, wishing for the 100th time she'd packed something warmer. Jack noticed her shiver and frown, but said nothing as he helped her into the passenger seat. The truck's engine growled to life, the tires crunching through the frozen snow as they began the winding descent toward town. "You warm enough?" Jack asked, sneaking a glance at her. "I'm fine," she lied, though her teeth wanted to chatter. He snorted. "Worse liar than my mother. We'll get you proper winter gear in town." "I can't let you do that." "Can't let me what?" There was a hint of a challenge in his voice, but his eyes danced with humor. "Take care of what's mine." The word mine hung in the air between them. Heat rose to Clara's cheeks, but she managed to match his teasing tone. "Is that what I am?" "Well, you're sleeping in my bed, aren't you?" His grin widened at her blush. "Even if I am stuck in that hammock." The drive seemed shorter this time, filled with light banter and lingering looks. But as they approached town, Clara felt tension creep back into her shoulders. The memory of the cruel laughter at the depot was still raw. Jack parked in front of the mercantile. Before Clara could reach for the door handle, he was there, opening it for her. The bell above the shop door jangled as they entered. The warm air inside smelled of leather, coffee, and wool. Conversation died, heads turned. Clara recognized several faces from the depot, men who had pointed and whispered. Now they fell silent, their smiles thin and careful as they watched Jack guide her toward the winter coats, his hand resting possessively at the small of her back. "Well, well now," a deep voice cut through the quiet, "if it isn't the Amazon Queen herself." A tall, handsome man pushed away from the counter, his face twisted in a smile that never reached his cold eyes. Clara remembered his laugh being the loudest when Edward hadn't shown. "Roy," Jack said, his voice flat and hard. "Thought you'd be long gone by now," Roy continued, his charm as false as fool's gold. "Unless you decided you wanted a real man after all." Clara felt Jack go rigid beside her. The air in the store grew thick with tension. Behind the counter, the shopkeeper leaned close to another man, whispering, "That's Jack Harlan's claim she's staying on. Roy won't like that one bit." Clara straightened to her full height, letting Roy see exactly how far up he had to look to meet her eyes. Her voice came out steady and clear. "I already did." Without breaking eye contact with Roy, she slipped her arm through Jack's, feeling the coiled, dangerous strength in him. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Roy's fake smile vanished, replaced by something ugly, something that promised trouble. The drive back up the mountain was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet, a dangerous quiet. Jack's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. "What was that about?" Clara asked softly. Jack didn't answer right away. He just stared at the road ahead, at the dark storm clouds that were gathering once again over the peaks. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low growl. "That was about a man who takes what he wants, and right now, he wants you." The old truck labored up the mountain road, its headlights cutting through the thickening storm. Snowflakes danced like restless spirits in the beams, hypnotic and disorienting. Inside the cab, the silence felt heavy, a tangible thing between them. Jack's knuckles were still white on the steering wheel. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice low and rough, like gravel. Roy's trouble. Always has been. He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the treacherous road ahead. Clara swallowed hard. What does he want from you? Land. Power. Jack's answer came flat and cold. He navigated a sharp bend, the truck's tires crunching ominously. And men like him, they don't like being made to look like a fool. It makes them dangerous. Clara watched his profile, the muscles in his neck standing out like taut cords. You know, she said carefully, his words, they didn't bother me as much as I thought they would. Jack glanced at her, surprise momentarily replacing the hardness in his eyes. Because you stood by me, she continued softly, her voice barely audible above the engine's rumble. No one's ever done that before. Everyone else just looked away. Or worse, they joined in. The hard set of Jack's jaw softened slightly. He turned toward her, and for a moment, she saw something intense flicker in his eyes, a flame of emotion that seemed to burn away the cold. He looked like he was about to say something, something important, but the moment was shattered as the truck hit a patch of black ice. The vehicle slid sideways with a heart-stopping screech, the tires spinning uselessly. Jack cursed, but his hands moved with calm precision, guiding them back onto solid ground. When they were straight again, Jack let out a long breath that fogged the air. We'll be snowed in soon, he said, his voice gentler now. That means quiet. He paused, then added with a quiet intensity that made her stomach flutter. And safe. Safe with him. The thought bloomed in Clara's chest, a strange mix of warmth and a trembling sort of fear that wasn't fear at all. As they crested the last hill, their cabin came into view below, a warm beacon in the gathering night. Golden lamplight spilled from the windows, painting rectangles of warmth on the pristine snow. Jack had left the porch light burning. It was as if the cabin itself was waiting faithfully for their return. He rolled the truck to a stop. Clara pushed her door open and stepped out into snow that reached above her knees. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. Jack was already grabbing supplies from the truck bed, muscles straining visibly under the weight of feed sacks and boxes. He caught her watching him. Tomorrow, he said, his breath clouding in the frigid air, I'll teach you how to split wood proper. You'll need to know if we're going to be stuck up here for a while. The wind rose around them with a mournful howl, driving the snow harder. They made their way to the cabin door, heads bent against the stinging cold, moving together toward the only light for miles around. And as they stepped inside, a terrifying thought crossed Clara's mind. It wasn't the storm she was afraid of being trapped by. It was him. Morning crept over the mountains like a hesitant ghost. Clara woke to the steady rhythm of an axe chopping wood, the sound carrying clearly through the cabin's thick walls. Her breath fogged the window as she peered through the frosted glass. Jack stood in the clearing, his powerful form moving with fluid grace as he swung the axe. His sleeves were rolled up despite the biting cold, revealing forearms corded with muscle. She found his spare coat hanging by the door and wrapped it around herself. It smelled of pine and wood smoke, of him. The cold hit her face as she stepped outside, the snow crunching beneath her boots. Jack paused mid-swing when he saw her, a slow grin spreading across his face. Ready to learn? He asked, holding the axe out to her, handle first. She took it, feeling its weight and balance. She positioned herself as she'd seen him do, feet planted firmly apart. The first swing was awkward, but the axe bit deep into the log. With a satisfying crack, the wood split clean in two. Jack let out a low whistle. Well, he drawled, clearly impressed. Maybe I should have hired you instead of looking for a bride. His tone held nothing but admiration, and their shared laughter rolled across the snow-covered clearing. They fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side. Clara found herself stealing glances at Jack, at the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. When they finished, they sat on the chopping block to rest, their shoulders touching. The words Clara had held back for so long finally spilled out. She told him about growing up as the too big girl, about the dances where she stood alone, the whispers that followed her everywhere. Jack listened without interruption, his gaze steady and warm. When she finished, he spoke with a quiet conviction that shook her to her core. Those men were blind. His hand found hers, his rough palm covering her work-warm skin. You're not too big. You're built for this land. You're built to survive. Back inside the cabin, the fire crackled merrily. Jack pulled out a bucket of pine tar and began showing her how to patch a leak in the roof. Their hands brushed as he demonstrated the proper technique, and heat sparked between them, raw and electric. Clara's heart thundered in her chest as their fingers tangled together over the tar brush. Outside, the snow began to fall harder, obscuring the world beyond their windows, cutting them off from everything and everyone but each other. Looking at Jack's profile in the firelight, Clara felt something shift deep inside her chest. A dangerous, hopeful thought took root. If this storm never ends, she thought, maybe I wouldn't mind. Evening shadows stretched across the cabin floor. The wind howled around the log walls, making the window panes rattle. Inside, the lantern cast a warm glow over the table, where Clara and Jack sat finishing their simple supper. The air between them felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. Jack cleared his throat. I know I ain't Edward, he said, his voice rough but determined, but I meant every word of my ad. Clara's head snapped up, her eyes wide. He leaned forward, his face serious in the flickering light. I wasn't looking for someone to write pretty letters to. I wanted a partner, someone strong enough to handle this life up here. His eyes never left her face. And you think that's me? Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't think. Jack's voice grew fiercer, more certain. He reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers, stilling their nervous movement. I know. Clara tried to speak, but the words were tangled in her throat. All her life, men had turned away from her height, her strength. They'd made her feel awkward and unwanted. But here was Jack, looking at her like she was something precious, something rare and wonderful. His thumb traced a gentle pattern on her knuckles. The touch sent sparks of warmth racing up her arm. A sudden, sharp howl split the night air. It was closer than any wolf cry should be. Jack was on his feet in an instant, his hand slipping from hers as he reached for the rifle mounted above the fireplace. The tender moment between them shattered like ice. They moved to the window together, breath fogging the glass as they peered out into the darkness. Through the frost, Clara could make out dark, fluid shapes moving at the tree line. The wolves were bold tonight, driven down from the high country by the bitter weather. Jack worked the rifle's action with practiced ease. The metallic clicks seemed unnaturally loud in the cabin. He turned to her, his face half in shadow. Stay inside, he ordered quietly. Lock the door. Clara watched him shrug into his heavy coat, the rifle steady in his hands. Her heart clenched at the thought of him facing them alone. As another wolf cry echoed through the night, she wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the fire. The thought hit her like a physical blow. He would fight for her without hesitation. He would die for her. The question was, what would she be willing to fight for when the time came? The wind howled like a living creature, rattling the cabin's windows and making the flames in the hearth dance wildly. Clara paced back and forth, the heavy iron fire poker clutched in her hands. Every few steps, she paused, straining her ears against the storm's fury, searching for the sound of gunfire. The waiting was pure torture. A sharp crack split the night, a rifle shot. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. Seconds stretched into an eternity before another shot shattered the darkness. Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard it hurt. Jack, she whispered, the name lost in the wind. She couldn't stand it anymore. The need to know, to help, to do something overwhelmed her fear. Clara lunged for the door, yanking it open with enough force to make the hinges groan. The winter night hit her like a physical blow. Snow whipped across her face, sharp as needles. She squinted against the stinging crystals, scanning the darkness desperately. Movement, near the woodpile. Shapes writhing in the snow. Her blood turned to ice. She could make out Jack, wrestling with a massive gray wolf, its jaws snapping inches from his throat. His rifle lay forgotten in a snowdrift several feet away. Clara didn't think. She didn't plan. Her body moved on pure, primal instinct, driven by a surge of protective fury that burned hotter than any fear she had ever known. 3 long strides brought her to the woodpile. She dropped the useless poker and seized a fallen log in both hands, its weight familiar from their morning's work. The wolf never saw her coming. She swung the log with every ounce of strength in her tall frame, putting her whole body into the motion just as Jack had taught her. The impact shuddered up her arms as the log connected with the wolf's ribs with a sickening crack. The beast crumpled with a yelp and lay still in the bloody snow. Jack staggered backward, his chest heaving as he gulped in the frozen air. Blood trickled from a fresh gash on his cheek, stark red against his pale skin. His eyes were wide as they fixed on Clara, standing tall in the swirling snow, the log still gripped in her hands like a weapon. For what felt like an eternity, they just stared at each other. The snow danced around them like white fire, caught in the light spilling from the cabin's open door. Finally, Jack broke into a crooked grin, though it must have pulled at his wound. "Remind me," he whispered, his voice hoarse and filled with an awe that made Clara's stomach flip. "Never to cross you." Back inside the cabin, Clara's hands trembled as she cleaned the gash on Jack's jaw with warm water and a clean cloth. He sat perfectly still, wincing occasionally but never pulling away. His eyes never left her face. "You could have died," she whispered, her voice shaky. Jack's hand came up to catch her wrist, stilling her nervous movements. His skin was rough and warm against hers. "Would have been worth it," he said, his voice raw and intimate in the firelit quiet. Their eyes locked. Clara forgot how to breathe. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, something far more dangerous than any winter gale had just ignited between them. Dawn crept through the frosted window panes. The storm continued its assault outside, but the wolves had retreated. Clara stirred on the bed, her muscles aching. Her eyes snapped open when she realized Jack's hammock was empty. Panic surged through her, the memory of snapping jaws and blood on snow still terrifyingly fresh. The steady thunk of an axe cutting through wood drifted through the walls. Relief flooded through her as she rushed to the window. Jack stood in the clearing, strong and steady, splitting logs with his usual fluid grace. The bandage on his jaw stood out starkly, but he showed no sign of weakness. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up and grinned. "Coffee's on the stove," he called, his voice carrying clearly through the glass. The tension between them crackled like static electricity as he stomped inside a few minutes later. Clara's eyes kept drifting to the bandage, his words echoing in her mind. "Would have been worth it." The crunch of tires on snow cut through their quiet breakfast like a knife. Jack muttered a curse and grabbed his rifle. The cabin door creaked open without a knock. Roy's bulky frame filled the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders. He leaned against the frame with a casual arrogance, his cold eyes crawling over Clara. "Heard you found yourself a big old prize, Jack," Roy drawled, his lips curving in a smile that never reached his eyes. Jack stepped between them, his shorter frame somehow seeming to fill more space than Roy's. "State your business," he said, his voice flat and hard as river ice. Roy's laugh was low and ugly. "Business is my offer." His gaze slid past Jack to fix on Clara again. "She don't belong to you, Harlan. A woman like that needs a real man." The threat was unmistakable. Clara watched Jack's jaw flex, the muscle jumping beneath the bandage she'd placed there. The tension in the cabin grew thick enough to choke on. Roy pushed off from the door frame, still wearing that cold smile. "You'll be seeing me again," he promised, the words hanging in the air like smoke. The door slammed shut, leaving a silence as thick as ice in his wake. Clara stood frozen, her heart pounding. She stared at Jack's rigid back, at the rifle still clutched in his hands. The thought settled in her mind, like a stone dropping into a still pond. Jack wasn't the only danger out here in these wild mountains. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't mind his kind of danger at all. The afternoon dimmed early, choked by storm clouds that pressed down on the mountains like a heavy wool blanket. Clara stood by the hearth, staring into the dancing flames. Her nerves still hummed from Roy's visit. Behind her, the steady scrape, scrape, scrape of stone against steel filled the silence as Jack methodically sharpened his axe. The tension was a bowstring pulled tight, ready to snap. She couldn't bear it. Without turning from the fire, she asked, "Why does he hate you so much?" The sharpening pause for a heartbeat, then resumed. Jack's voice came clipped and hard. Roy wants what ain't his. Always has. The flames popped and hissed. Clara's fingers curled against the mantel as she gathered her courage. Her next words came out as barely a whisper. And me? Do I belong to you, Jack? The rhythmic scraping stopped completely. She heard the soft creak of wood as Jack rose from his chair, his measured footsteps crossing the floor. She felt his presence before she saw him, a warmth at her back, an electric charge in the air. He stopped just inches away. His voice dropped low, rough as bark. You belong wherever you choose. He paused and she could feel his eyes on her profile. But if you're asking what I want, his voice trailed off as his gaze traveled slowly down her body, leaving a trail of fire in its wake. Then yeah, I want you. Clara's breath caught. The fire behind them was nothing compared to the heat building between their bodies. She turned her head slightly, finding Jack's eyes blazing like molten steel in the firelight. The space between them crackled. Her heart thundered as she began to turn toward him, drawn by a force as inevitable as gravity. A loud crack split the air outside, sharp as a gunshot. They both jumped, the spell shattering. Jack cursed and yanked away, already reaching for his coat. Roof beam's giving, he muttered, shoving his arms into the sleeves. Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed her own coat and followed him out into the howling storm. Together they worked to brace the straining beam, hefting logs through knee-deep snow, their breath fogging in the freezing air. Every time their hands brushed, electricity jolted through her. She couldn't stop thinking about how close they had been by the fire, about the raw hunger in his voice when he'd said he wanted her. As they finished, Clara pressed a hand to her flushed cheek, knowing the heat there had nothing to do with the cold. The truth whispered through her mind, impossible to ignore any longer. I wanted him to kiss me. God help me, I still do. Morning broke with startling clarity. The storm had finally spent its fury, but the pristine beauty came with a price. Snow was piled high around Jack's truck, rendering it useless. The supplies were running dangerously low. Jack pulled on his heaviest coat and strapped leather snowshoes to his boots. I have to go to town, he said. I'm coming with you, Clara announced, her voice leaving no room for argument. Jack hesitated. It's a hard trek. The trail's barely visible. Clara met his gaze steadily. I'm stronger than I look. A ghost of a smile touched Jack's lips. I never doubted that for a second. They set out as the sun climbed higher. Jack took point, breaking trail, while Clara followed. Her longer legs and natural strength proved to be an advantage. She matched him, stride for stride, never complaining about the brutal pace. By noon they reached the outskirts of town. Jack helped her navigate a steep section, his strong hands steady at her waist. The touch lingered longer than necessary. The spell broke when they pushed open the mercantile's door. Conversation died. Roy lounged against the counter as if he'd been waiting for them, his wolfish grin spreading slow and mean. Well now, he drawled. Looks like Jack's got himself a giant for keeps. Jack ignored him, moving to the counter to order their supplies. Roy sauntered closer to Clara, invading her space with deliberate menace. You sure this little man's enough for you, darling? His voice dripped with crude suggestion. Seems to me you need someone more substantial. The room held its breath, but before Jack could react, Clara drew herself up to her full, impressive height, towering over Roy like an avenging angel. Her voice cut through the tension like a steel blade. He's plenty enough for me. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Roy's smirk faltered, then twisted into something ugly. Jack quickly paid, his shoulders rigid with barely contained fury, and guided Clara toward the door. The whispers followed them like snakes. Won't last. Roy won't let it. They were halfway back up the mountain when Jack finally broke his silence. If Roy comes near you again, he growled, I'll bury him. Clara stopped, grabbing his arm to turn him toward her. Don't. He's not worth it. Jack stared up at her, something fierce and protective blazing in his eyes. Without warning, he reached up to cup her jaw, his rough thumb brushing across her cold, flushed cheek. You are. Time froze. They stood so close, their breath mingled, their lips mere inches apart. The tension crackled. But Jack pulled away suddenly, dropping his hand. "Storm's coming again," he muttered, turning back to the trail. He was right. By the time they stumbled back into the cabin, darkness had fallen, and the wind was screaming like a banshee. They burst into the cabin just as the storm hit full force, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Jack slammed the door against the rising wind, his fury a living thing in the small space. He paced like a caged animal. Clara tried to steady her trembling hands as she began unpacking their supplies. Her heart wouldn't settle. Her hands shook, not from the cold, but from the memory of Roy's sneering face, from Jack's barely contained rage, from the electricity that had sparked between them on the trail. Jack stalked past her, every muscle coiled tight. He made it 3 steps before stopping dead. The floorboards creaked as he spun back. His calloused fingers wrapped around her wrist, stopping her nervous organizing. Heat blazed where his skin met hers. "You think I'm done holding back?" His voice was rough as mountain granite, deep and raw. "After what he said to you, after the way you look at me?" Her lips parted, but her voice was a whisper. "Jack." He didn't let her finish. In one fluid motion, he pulled her to him, claiming her mouth with his. The kiss was desperate, hungry, filled with all the words they hadn't said. His beard scratched her skin as his free hand tangled in her hair, holding her close. For one heartbeat, Clara froze, overwhelmed. Then something wild and wanting broke loose inside her. Her hands fisted in his shirt, dragging him even closer. He growled low in his throat, deepening the kiss until the world outside, the snow, the wind, the danger, ceased to exist. There was only this. The wind screamed, rattling the door in its frame, crashing through their bubble of heat. Jack broke the kiss, but didn't pull away. He pressed his forehead to hers, his breath coming fast and uneven. When he spoke, his voice was fierce with possession and a raw, unbreakable promise. "You ain't ever going back." Tears burned behind Clara's eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally finding where she belonged. Her answer came straight from her heart, soft but certain. "I don't want to." The blizzard had erased the world. Snow piled high around the cabin, a silent, white prison. Jack stood at the door, his jaw set. "No leaving today," he said. "Maybe not tomorrow." The words hung in the warm air. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the space between them charged. Last night's kiss haunted Clara's thoughts. Every accidental brush of hands, every caught glance, sent sparks dancing along her skin. They tried to keep busy. Jack fixed a loose door hinge. Clara kneaded dough for biscuits. "Pass me that nail." Jack's voice was gruff, but his eyes lingered on her. Their fingers brushed. Neither pulled away. The small talk slowly deepened. "My old man," Jack said, not looking up from his work. "He walked out when I was 12. Mama raised me alone. Taught me everything." His hands stilled. "I built this cabin myself. Every log, every nail. Took 3 years. Had to have something that was mine. Something solid." The confession opened something in Clara. "They all wanted me smaller somehow," she said, her voice a whisper. "Quieter. Less than everything I am." Jack's tools clattered to the floor as he stood abruptly. His eyes blazed. "Don't you ever shrink for any man," he said, his voice rough with emotion. The words felt like a vow. As evening approached, the blizzard's fury intensified. The cabin's timbers groaned under the growing weight of the snow on the roof. Jack's expression turned grim. "We'll have to clear the roof tomorrow," he said, "or it'll crush us." The storm raging outside was fierce, but it didn't frighten Clara half as much as the storm she felt building inside. Whenever Jack looked at her the way he was looking at her now, like she was something precious and wild, and exactly, perfectly right. Morning was a dim, bruised light through the relentless curtain of snow. The cabin's roof groaned, the sound growing more ominous by the minute. Jack pulled on his heavy coat. "Stay inside," he ordered. Clara was already pulling on her boots. "If that roof falls, you won't be quick enough." Her voice held the same steel that had faced down Roy. "You need my help. I'm stronger than you, Jack. And you know it." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. He handed her a pair of gloves. "Just be careful." They pushed into a world of howling white. On the roof, the wind hit them with the force of a physical blow. "Start from the edge," Jack shouted over the gale. But Clara was already moving. Her natural strength and size gave her an advantage. She drove her shovel into the packed snow with powerful strokes, clearing more with each scoop than Jack could manage. She had just straightened to wipe her brow when she heard it. A sharp crack that cut through the wind. A beam splintered. Jack's eyes went wide. "Clara!" he roared. His body slammed into hers, shoving her aside just as a section of the roof, a nightmare of snow and splintered timber, plunged downward. In a heartbeat, he vanished in a roar of white. "Jack!" The scream tore from her throat. She scrambled down from the roof, not feeling the ice that cut her palms. She found him half buried, one leg pinned beneath a massive roof beam. Blood seeped into the snow, shockingly red. His face was twisted in pain, but his eyes found hers. Something primal rose in Clara's chest, a mixture of fury and fear that set her blood on fire. With a guttural cry, she seized the beam. Her muscles strained, tendons standing out in her neck. The beam shifted. It lifted. Jack dragged himself free with a grunt of pain. Clara helped him up, supporting his weight as they stumbled toward the cabin. "You're not leaving me," she whispered fiercely. "Not like this." Inside, the fire roared. Clara lowered Jack onto the bed, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, blood seeping through his torn pants. Her hands shook as she took his hunting knife and sliced through the heavy fabric. The gash was deep and angry. "Don't you dare move," she commanded when he tried to sit up. Despite the pain, his lips curled into a weak smirk. "Bossy. I like that." She moved with a desperate purpose, putting water on to boil, gathering clean rags, his medical book, the whiskey he kept for emergencies. Without hesitation, she reached under her heavy dress and tore long strips from her own petticoat for bandages. The medical book lay open beside her as she threaded a needle, her hands still trembling. At the first touch of the needle, Jack's hand shot out and gripped hers, not to stop her, but to steady her. His eyes never left her face. The trust in his gaze almost undid her. "You're doing fine," he murmured, his jaw tight with pain. "Steady hands." She worked methodically, her stitches clean and even. Blood welled around the needle, but she pressed on. "Thought you'd be gone by now," he said suddenly, his voice weak. "After all this." Clara paused, leaning close. "You're a fool if you think I'd leave you now." As night deepened, his skin grew hot to the touch. Fever took hold. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his fingers finding hers in the darkness, gripping with surprising strength. "If I die," he rasped, his eyes glassy but intense, "don't let Roy get near you." Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks, falling onto his chest as she bent over him, her lips pressing against his, tasting salt and fever and fear. "You're not dying," she whispered fiercely against his mouth. "You hear me? You're mine now." Morning crept into the cabin. The storm had finally settled. Clara sat by the bed, her eyes heavy from her long vigil. A low groan escaped Jack's lips as his eyes fluttered open. The fever had broken. Relief crashed through her so powerfully her knees went weak. He immediately tried to push himself up, grimacing. Clara was there in an instant, her hands gentle as she steadied him. "Don't move," she said, laughing and crying at the same time, "or I'll tie you down." A wicked grin tugged at his mouth. "Promise?" he asked, his voice rough but full of his usual mischief. She brought him a bowl of the stew she'd made during the night. As she sat beside him, he reached out and took her hand. "I ain't good at pretty words," he said, his voice thick with emotion. His thumb traced circles on her palm. "But I know this. If you'll have me, Clara, I'm yours, till my last breath." Her throat tightened. She reached out to cup his jaw. "I spent my whole life thinking I was too much for any man," she whispered. His storm gray eyes met hers, full of a certainty that made her chest ache with love. "Turns out," she finished, a radiant smile breaking across her face, "you were just enough for me." Jack's hand slid into her hair, and he pulled her close. When their lips met, it wasn't desperate like before. This was slow, tender, and deep, like the ancient roots of the mountain itself. It held promises neither of them needed to speak aloud. They both knew the storm that had nearly taken him was just the beginning of their story. But for now, they were safe in their own world of firelight and newfound love. The real world, however, was waiting just down the mountain, and it was coming for them. The mountain morning dawned crisp and bright. A fragile peace had settled over the cabin. Jack's leg was healing, though he still favored it. They fell into an easy rhythm, Clara cooking, Jack mending tools from his chair, their evenings spent in comfortable silence, hands intertwined. Then a sharp knock shattered everything. Jack's head snapped up, his hand instantly reaching for the rifle prop nearby. His body went rigid, the relaxed man of moments ago replaced by a watchful predator. The door swung open. Roy's tall frame was silhouetted against the bright snow. The sheriff stood slightly behind him, looking uncomfortable, along with another man from town. Roy's smile was as sharp and venomous as a snake's. His gaze swept the cabin before settling on Clara. "Morning, Jack. Looks like you've been harboring stolen property." Jack's grip tightened on his rifle. "You best leave now," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. Roy stepped inside uninvited, his boots tracking dirty snow across the clean floor. His gaze raked over Clara with an unconcealed hunger that made her skin crawl. "You came here for Edward, didn't you?" "Well, Edward changed his mind. And in this town, that makes you free game." The sheriff shifted his weight. "Jack, the town's talking. Folks are saying you kidnapped her." Something snapped inside Clara. A lifetime of being talked about, talked around and decided for, crystallized into pure white-hot anger. She stepped forward, drawing herself up to her full, impressive height. "Kidnapped?" Her voice rang with steel. "I came here by choice, and I'm staying by choice." She planted her feet, hands balled into fists. "No man owns me or decides my fate. Not Edward, not you, not anyone." Roy's smirk faltered, his face darkening with rage. He lunged, his hand outstretched to grab her arm. In one fluid motion, Jack brought the rifle up, level with Roy's chest. The click of the hammer being pulled back echoed in the sudden, deafening silence. The sheriff's hand moved to his own holstered gun. "You can't just hold up here, Jack. Sooner or later, this needs settling." Jack's voice was pure iron, his eyes never leaving Roy's face. "Then we'll settle it now. You want her? You'll have to take her over my dead body." Roy's face twisted into an ugly sneer, his hand drifting toward the knife at his belt. "That," he hissed, "can be arranged." Dawn crept over the valley, painting the snow in shades of pearl and gold. Jack stood by the door, strapping on his gun belt. His movements were precise, grim. "Don't go," Clara pleaded, her voice trembling. He turned, crossing the space between them in 3 limping strides. He raised a hand, his thumb brushing her cheek, a gesture of aching tenderness. "You saved my life," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Now I protect yours. That's the way of it." Without another word, he headed for the truck. Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat and followed. "I'm not hiding while you fight my battles," she declared. The town streets were nearly empty, save for a cluster of men gathered outside the mercantile. Roy stood front and center, his feral grin spreading as they parked. Jack stepped out, favoring his good leg but standing tall. Clara emerged beside him, drawing herself up to her full height. Together they strode toward the crowd, step for step. "Want to settle this?" Jack's voice carried in the cold air. "Do it like a man." Roy shrugged off his coat. The fight exploded. Roy lunged. Jack met him with a solid right hook. Snow flew as they churned the ground. Jack's experience showed, but his injured leg betrayed him. He couldn't pivot fast enough. They went down hard. Roy scrambled on top, pinning him, raising his fist for a crushing blow. Clara moved like lightning. Her hand clamped around Roy's upraised wrist with devastating force, yanking him backward. The crowd gasped as she effortlessly wrenched his arm behind his back, her superior height and strength suddenly, shockingly apparent. "Touch him again," she snarled, her voice cracking like a whip across the stunned silence, "and I will break you in half." The threat hung in the air, crystal clear and utterly believable. No one moved. No one breathed. Finally, the sheriff cleared his throat, his voice firm. "She's made her choice. That's the end of it." Roy jerked free, spitting blood into the snow. His glare promised this wasn't over, but for now he slunk back toward his cronies. Clara turned to Jack, who was pushing himself up. Despite his split lip, he grinned up at her with fierce, unadulterated pride. She slipped under his arm, supporting his weight as they turned away. Walking back to the truck, her heart swelled. The whole town had seen her strength, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel the need to shrink herself one single bit. Spring transformed the mountain. Patches of rich, dark earth emerged from the snow. The air smelled of wet bark and the first brave wildflowers. At the cabin, Jack stood on the porch, wearing a clean white shirt, his dark hair combed back. He was watching the awakening forest. Clara stepped out behind him. She'd sewn a simple dress from soft cotton that flowed over her tall frame, and she'd woven wildflowers into her hair. Jack's breath caught. He turned, his eyes drinking in the sight of her, towering, radiant, and magnificent. "You're a vision," he murmured. A small group had gathered in the yard. The traveling preacher, the sheriff, and an elderly couple who were their nearest neighbors. Pine needles and early flowers cushioned their steps as they took their places. Jack reached for her hands, his weathered and compact, hers large and strong. He held them like they were the most precious things in the world. The preacher's words rolled over them, but it was their own vows that silenced the mountain. Jack's voice was husky. "Didn't think I deserved a woman like you," he admitted, squeezing her hands. "But if you'll have me, I'll spend my life proving I was worth the fight." Tears sparkled in Clara's eyes, but her voice rang clear and true. "I spent my whole life thinking I was too much for any man," she said, her smile radiant. "Turns out I was made just for you. I now pronounce you husband and wife." Jack reached up, his calloused hands infinitely gentle as they cupped her face. She bent to meet him, and he drew her into a kiss that was slow, deep, and filled with the certainty of home. It held a promise more binding than any law. The small gathering faded away, leaving just the two of them, framed against the towering pines. His arms wrapped tight around her waist, her head bent to his, their foreheads touching. In her heart, Clara felt a warmth deeper than any summer day. "I came to these mountains chasing a broken dream," she thought, "and I found a love bigger than the mountains themselves." I believe stories like this find us for a reason. If this one touched your heart, please hit that subscribe button. I share a new one every single day, and tomorrow's might just be the one you've been waiting for.